Let's have a nice cup of TRE in the afternoon with Hannah Murray.
Joining us on the line now is Nicola Tallant, a three-time winner of Crime Journalist of the Year award in Ireland. She specialises in organised and gangland crime. Her latest book, Groomed, is the horrifying story of Jonathan Creswell and the rape and murder of 21-year-old show jumper Katie Simpson, who was initially thought to have taken her own life until Creswell's crime was uncovered. Welcome to the show, Nicola.
Thank you very much.
It's great to have you with us. So how does one become a crime journalist? Why did you take that path?
Well, I don't know whether I chose it. I think it sort of chose me when I was a younger journalist, and it was necessary for me to take whatever work was going. At the time, there was a lot of work around crime here in Dublin, and I just kind of fell into it that way. I was always interested in it, but I certainly didn't pursue it. It went from there, basically. And I suppose as you start covering it, you start building up contacts and you start bringing in stories and you start building up a bit of an expertise. And here I am 30 years later.
Yeah, interesting. And you must have sort of researched and looked into some colourful characters over the years.
For certain, absolutely. And mainly my work would actually be in organised crime and figures in what we'd call gangland, who are often very violent, but they're also a little bit more basic than the current guy I've been writing about. They're a little bit more... When I say basic, you can kind of understand their motivation a bit more.
Yeah.
A lot of it is basically about money. It's about power. You know, if they fall out with somebody, it's simply a bullet is maybe another way of doing business. Now, that's all a bit harsh, yeah, but you can understand them. Whereas the subject of my new book, Groomed, Jonathan Creswell, is a very dark creature and forced me to look further into the soul of humanity than any of those that operate in the sphere of organised crime ever have.
Yeah. So tell us a bit about Jonathan Creswell, what he's like as a person, or what he was like.
Yeah, so he's a show jumper. He's living in a sort of a small society north of the border. He's a big fish in a small pond, drops out of school early because he's pursuing this career on horseback, and has a confidence from about the age of 16 that's really hard to imagine, because most 16-year-old boys are full of insecurities, you know, and they take a long time, I suppose, to gain confidence. Feels like even longer nowadays. But he is so confident at that stage that he develops and begins a relationship with a woman 8 years his senior. And not only does he conduct that relationship very confidently in public, but he's the boss. He's the boss, and he treats her badly. He does the dirt on her. He breaks her heart, and he goes on from that relationship to form many, many others. There's been a lot of talk about this story, and I called the book actually Groomed because, you know, there's been a lot of, because he was so young, I think people refer to him forming relationships or having sex, but he absolutely groomed Katie Simpson, who was only 21 when she died. And he began grooming her from the age of 10. He was accused before his own death of her rape and her murder. There was nothing agreeable to any relationship that existed between them. So, yes, Jonathan Creswell, I've jumped a little bit there, but he was a guy who enthralled and seemed to mesmerise women, or else disgust them. He was one of those very divisive characters, and pretty much the same with men or people who came into his sphere. But he built up this almost cult-like structure around him, where he was obviously the cult leader, and he had just like a group of women who were terrified and mesmerised by him in equal portions, and who did his bidding, and who he used and abused. I don't think any of them believed he was capable of murder, but unfortunately for three of them in particular, they ended up forming part of the cover-up into the death of Katie, their close friend.
Gosh. So he knew her for a really long time. You're saying from the age of 10 to 21.
Well, he was actually dating and had 2 children with her older sister, Christina. So he didn't only know her, but she was sort of, he was part of the wider family. And he treated her really badly and in open sight. I mean, there's a lot of questions really for the equestrian industry here, and something that I had never considered. It's not been a sport I've been involved in myself. I would have always sort of seen it as being for the elite, maybe. But actually, when you dig into it and you look at it, the lifestyle around it is really somewhere that somebody like Jonathan Creswell can thrive. There's early mornings, there's late nights, there's, long hours, and there's quiet stable buildings and barns where a lot of the abuses he doled out took place. And people spoke to me about show jumping and jockeying and all the rest of it, that there is this sense that some of the best horsemen are almost seen as rock stars. So they're given this sort of celebrity status, if you will. Since this all happened between Jonathan Creswell and Katie Simpson and the other friends, there have been calls here for an inquiry into everything that went on, similar to the Savile inquiry. How did this guy get away with treating women and, committing crimes for as long as he did? Why did people not shout stop? Why did people not, or did they turn a blind eye to it because he was somebody who was, so good on horseback and so celebrated in that sport?
Yeah. So at what point did it start to unfold? Did people realise what he'd been doing for so many years?
Well, believe it or not, it was actually the kindness, I think, and the tenacity and the sense of justice of strangers. He presented Katie Simpson at 21 years of age to a hospital in Derry in Northern Ireland, with a story that he had found her hanging in the house where she was living with him and her sister and others. And he actually had said that he cut her body down, he put it in the car, and he drove along the road to meet the ambulance, which was unusual in the first place. There was bruises on her body, which didn't add up to a story. Yet police closed down any investigation fairly quickly and believed his narrative that she had taken her own life. Now, Jonathan Creswell was somebody already with a serious conviction for domestic violence some years previous towards a girlfriend, an ex-girlfriend. And yet that was believed. And for months in the aftermath of her death, no murder investigation or inquiry was launched. There has been massive police failings in the case, which are still subject to inquiries. But it took, say, for example, a nurse from the hospital who didn't feel things were right. It took relatives of Katie's who didn't believe she would take her life. It took a local journalist who was there when he was previously convicted of violence to women to be adding up and seeing red flags everywhere. And it took other friends and strangers to keep knocking down the door of the police station until eventually an independent officer was allowed to have a look at a case. And within literally a few days, a murder inquiry was launched. Jonathan Creswell was the chief suspect in her murder, and he was only a few months before he was arrested and charged. So massive failings to Katie Simpson in her life, and really also in her death. What I found really disgusting about the case was that Creswell not only murdered her, staged having raped her, but staged her death as a suicide, but he also was at her bedside as she died. Oh. And he was one of the chief mourners at her wake, and he lowered her coffin into the grave, which is really
sick.
Isn't it? Yeah. Like I just find that's what I'm saying to you. I'm not telling you I like these, organized crime bosses or, I think cartel killers are great guys. I'm just saying it is easier to understand their motivations than somebody like that. Yeah. I mean, that is a very dark human being that you hope you never ever encounter in life. And yet he didn't look like a monster. He didn't, to people on the outside come across as that. And yet he really, really was.
Gosh. So after he was convicted, was there a lot more kind of research and investigation done into his backstory and other things that he might have done along the way?
Well, I suppose he faced a murder trial, and while the trial opened the first day, by the second morning, as the jury gathered to hear more evidence, they were told that he had died. So he had taken as his trial began. But I suppose as regards into the background, who he was, where he came from, that's exactly the kind of, what attracted me to the story. And which resulted in this book. And I have just started releasing a 9-part podcast on my Crime World podcast here in Ireland as well in regards to it. But yeah, I started to just go back to where it all began. Who was he? Where did he come from? How did this individual end up like this? Was he born like that, I suppose, in a cliched way, or was he formed like that? And there was nothing enormous in his background to really explain him, other than he had been a pretty spoiled kid, He was born to a teenage mum, and he came home to a household of adults who all doted on him. His grandparents reared him as his own. He was particularly talented on horseback, and from a very young age was celebrated as this brilliant jockey. And that seemed to build in him a level of confidence, which was that step further than, I think there's always a fine line between confidence and arrogance. And definitely he had arrogance, but he also had this incredible ability to flirt with women old enough to be even his grandmother or his mother and have them fall head over heels for him. He was able to charm, he was able to disarm them, and in many cases he would have been almost grooming the parent to get at the daughter, heaping praise on their daughter's riding ability, that he could bring them to the next level if they stuck with him. He could show them the way into championships. Just a very, very manipulative character.
Yeah. And what was the fallout with his with Katie's sister, who was his partner? I mean, how could she possibly have coped with all this?
Yeah, so I mean, that in itself, 3 women, Jill Robinson, Hayley Robb and Rose de Montmorency Wright, all faced charges in relation to helping Jonathan Creswell cover up, albeit the death of Katie Simpson, not her murder. The judge made it clear during their sentences that they did not know he'd murdered her. However, he had sort of revealed to them that he had beaten her up the night before, and he didn't want the police to think he'd anything to do with her suicide. So the judge accepted that they covered up things from, for example, they washed his clothes, one of them, and cleaned blood off the banister in the house, and the others kind of kept his secret, I suppose. But the judge accepted that they did those things, but not realising that he'd murdered Katie. His sister was considered as part of that investigation. She was certainly, her actions were looked at, but it was decided that she would not be prosecuted. Christina Simpson did continue to live with Jonathan in the aftermath of her sister's death, and really up until he was charged and arrested for her sister's murder. And she would have then given various statements to the police that would, I mean, she certainly was living in fear of him too. And there was evidence that he had at one point broken her arm during the relationship. She was in fear of him. A lot of this story is about coercive control, which I think is something we're still beginning to understand. A lot of control can be psychological rather than physical. You don't have to physically hold somebody back to make them do your bidding. And Creswell certainly was a very powerful character when it came to the art of coercive control.
And through all the research that you've done, have you been able to get into his mind a bit? Have you been able to try and understand what drew him to do this?
I think he absolutely hated women, and he treated women and horses slightly similar because he could be cruel to both. Those who know much about equestrian say that you no longer even use the language around, when a horse is wild and they're being trained so as they will allow a rider sit on their back. They used to call it breaking a horse, but they no longer even use that language, and they no longer use force. It's a much more gentle thing that you get the horse to trust you, and slowly, and let it take its time to trust you to get up on its back first of all, and then have younger riders or whatever be safe there as well. Whereas Creswell was violent and vicious, and he broke the spirits of the animals, and he seemed to do the same with women. He had this very strange way of when he was doing, when he was making inappropriate remarks to women, he would pull their ponytails and sort of whip them and do similar to horses as women. I'm sure there's some psychologist who'd be able to explain that to you better, but they seem to run in tandem with him. And he also had this dream that he was going to be a great stud farm owner, and he was going to live, in some stately home with all these horses under his control, but also all these women, working for him and doing his bidding. So he's a very complex character. But I think ultimately, the one thing we can say for certain is that he absolutely, absolutely hated women. And, he was also aroused by violence towards women and by ridiculing them. He had a close relationship, actually, or seemingly close relationship with his own mother. He went to live with her after Katie had died. He went to live with her. Her sister Christina went with him, and she always minded his own children. But he had no other siblings, and there was nothing externally to say that he'd had a bad experience of either his mother or of growing up or anything. But, he certainly had a murderous dislike of women. So, make what you will of that.
Yeah, it's interesting to think of someone that hates women so much to still be really charming and flirtatious with women, like you said.
Well, the charm and the flirtation only lasted a period of time, and then he would turn cruel. Like, we have a very good witness as such in a lady called Abigail Lyle. Abby Lyle she competes in dressage. She actually represented Ireland in the Olympics this year out in Versailles, where the equestrian games were held. But she, as a 23-year-old, went out with Johnny Creswell. He was 20, and you're talking back at 2008, 2009. And she describes how she was basically blown away by him. She just was, would have seen herself as being a very sensible individual, even when it came to romance. But as soon as she met him, she was just blown away by how charming he was. He started to sort of love bomb her with texts, and she agreed to go on dates with him, and he was just the dreamboat. She brought him home to her family. He got on really well with her dad, with her mum. He'd come for Sunday dinner. He'd bring her places. If she needed a lift, he'd be the one that would give her the lift. She fell into this, what was, what looked like a very promising relationship to her. And literally out of the blue, about 4 or 5 months into that relationship, he collected her one night and he started smashing her head against the dashboard of the car as he drove her, somewhere.
Gosh, how awful.
Thumping her, punching her, all the rest of it. She was completely shocked. He was driving like a lunatic. She thought she was going to die. And in the aftermath of it all, she was stunned and shocked. But then he started to apologise and tell her he loved her and tell her he couldn't live without her. And the kindness that he showed after the cruelty sort of became a hook to her. And you see that in a lot of, relationships where you have domestic violence. You will see that kindness, cruelty kind of juggle. And it becomes a very powerful, controlling mechanism. But yeah, she spoke about how she never believed she was going to be in one of these relationships. After it, she looks back and she goes, how did that happen to me? And, somebody with a really supportive family.
Yeah.
With great prospects, with loads of friends, with everything you can imagine, an independent woman. And yet he managed to suck her into that relationship. She stayed in it way too long. She, her family realized he was isolating her, and the relationship only ended after he literally tried to kill her. One night, he drove her through an isolated forest over the border into the Republic of Ireland. He beat her over a matter of hours. He sweated as he did so, and he tried to string her up a tree with her own shirt around her neck, and eventually put her in the car, drove her back to his house. And she was utterly terrified. She'd the number at this stage of a domestic violence officer. Her father had got it for her. He was concerned about her, and it must have been in her head or in her phone, but she had the number, and she managed to escape briefly and phoned this officer who came and rescued her. She ended up in court with Johnny Creswell, and he pleaded guilty and, served 3 months in prison, but it did nothing against his popularity, because when he came back to his local village, where she was known too, and where these incidents had occurred, there was a party thrown for him. He was welcomed back. He'd managed to convince everybody that Abby was mad. She was just jealous. She couldn't cope with the attention that other women gave him. She'd made up the stories, and as an act of kindness, he had pleaded guilty because she was so daft, he didn't want to have to put her through the court case. And that was accepted,
Wow. Isn't that shocking? So other than Abby, do you think that he abused other women, or is there no evidence to suggest that?
Oh, he most certainly did. I mean, his control, there's many victims out there, I think, that we still haven't heard from, because I think a lot of victims are ashamed. They sometimes feel they did something maybe to deserve it, or maybe they entered into something with him, which turned nasty, and they feel a sense of shame, or there's other reasons they can't come forward. But we know, for example, that he beat and coercively controlled Hayley Robb, who was just 17 when she met him. She dropped out of school, sort of began working for him. He tried to use her as his alibi after he murdered Katie Simpson. We know that he was abusive to his ex-partner, Jill Robinson. She certainly was psychologically abused, if nothing else. We know he was abusive to his long-term partner, Christina Simpson, and the mother of his 2 children. And we know he murdered and raped, or certainly was accused of that, murdered and raped Katie. There was other women over the years that some made complaints about some of his, what he did, in particular one woman from Scotland who was working in the north in a stables along with her boyfriend. He exposed himself to her. He threatened her. He threatened the boyfriend in a very vicious manner. And they made complaints to police, who failed to arrest him. Used the border here in Ireland, in a way some people can. Some people will have a property in one jurisdiction and work in another, or spend their days in one jurisdiction and sleep in another one. It can be more difficult for them to be arrested. But again, I think that was a failing of the police in Northern Ireland, that they didn't pursue him more aggressively for arrest in the aftermath of the complaint made by that girl.
Yeah.
I think there's plenty more abuses there. Maybe they will never come out, or maybe they will. Jonathan Creswell is dead, and he's taken really the secrets of Katie's death to his grave. We don't know exactly what happened to her on the last night, other than she certainly was taken by him across the border to a lonely forest where she was raped. She was brought back to a house, arrived back alive, and never left it alive. But her final hours over the course of that, the early hours that morning, he managed to actually successfully cover up what exactly happened to her.
Awful. I mean, it's good that he's dead, that he can't harm anyone else, but it's a real shame that he wasn't brought to justice and isn't having a really crappy time in prison, isn't it?
Well, absolutely. I would agree with you, even though I'm supposed to be way more PC than that.
Yeah, but, I probably am as well, but there we go.
When you see somebody like Creswell who really manipulated the situation to the end, and the idea that she was clinging somewhat to life, although I imagine she had been, her heart had stopped for such a long period. I don't know, I'm no doctor, but I wouldn't have thought there was much brain function, but there could have been. And she could have been lying there clinging to life, and that he was over the bedside with her family telling them that she had she had taken her own life. I mean, that's the cruelest of all. And she couldn't defend herself. She'd no voice, and she couldn't survive what he'd done to her.
Well, if people want to get the book Groomed, it's available on our website, tre.radio, and it's by Nicola Tallant, who we've been chatting with today. Nicola, thank you so much for joining us.
A pleasure.